For centuries, Sudan has stood at the crossroads of Africa and the Arab world, a land shaped by ancient kingdoms, colonial ambitions, and revolutionary resilience. But behind the headlines of conflict and crisis lies a deeper, untold story. This is the full story of Sudan, a nation that has endured invasion, division, and unimaginable hardship, yet continues to rise again and again, refusing to bow from the mighty Nubian kingdoms that rivaled Egypt to the scars left by British-Egyptian rule and the decades-long struggle for independence. Sudan's journey is as complex as it is inspiring. This documentary unpacks the rich history, cultural identity, and political upheavals that have shaped modern-day Sudan. It's not just a story of war and division, it's one of resistance, revolution, and a people who will not be broken. Whether you're new to Sudanese history or seeking to understand the heart of this resilient nation, this video offers an eye-opening look into a country often misunderstood by the world. Dive into the full story, told with clarity, empathy, and a deep respect for the people who live it. Watch now, because Sudan is not just a country, it's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Beneath the sands of northeast Africa lies a forgotten kingdom, one that predates the pharaohs of Egypt, one whose pyramids outnumber those in Giza. This isn't the story you were taught in school. This is Sudan. 3,000 years before the name Sudan was even spoken, the fertile banks of the Nile south of Egypt birthed a civilization called Kerma. It wasn't a village, it was a kingdom, powerful, independent, and advanced. Their architecture stunned archaeologists, their pottery, superior even to Egypt's for centuries. They thrived, ruling over vast stretches of the Nile Valley. This was no minor outpost. Kerma was a rival, but eventually power shifted. Egypt, hungry for expansion, pushed southward. The once mighty Kerma fell under the weight of foreign armies. Yet what happened next would shock even the Egyptians. A new force rose from the ashes, the kingdom of Kush. Born in Nubia, centered in Napata and later Meroë, the Kushites didn't just survive, they conquered Egypt itself. In a stunning reversal, the 25th dynasty of Egypt was ruled by black African pharaohs from Sudan. They ruled not with weakness, but with reverence, restoring temples, preserving traditions. The pharaoh Taharka, one of the greatest rulers of this dynasty, is even mentioned in the Bible. Sudan, once the conquered, had become the conqueror. And yet, as centuries passed, power again shifted. Egypt reasserted dominance, then came Rome. But Sudan didn't disappear. The kingdom of Meroë, successor to Kush, flourished deeper south along the Nile. This era birthed the famed Meroitic pyramids, smaller but more numerous than Egypt's. They're steeper, darker, and still stand today, largely untouched, whispering stories of a past erased from most history books. Why is this important? Because history isn't just dates and ruins, it's identity. And Sudan's identity began not in war, but in majesty, a black African kingdom that stood toe-to-toe with empires. This is where the fight to remain unbowed truly began. Sudan's story didn't pause after Meroë. As the old powers faded, new empires looked south. From across deserts and seas, forces came with fire, faith, and flags. Sudan became a battleground of civilizations, a meeting point of African resilience and foreign ambition. By the 6th century, Christianity had taken root. In Nubia, 3 Christian kingdoms emerged: Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia. They built cathedrals from stone and translated Bibles into local languages. Makuria, especially, stood as a marvel of medieval diplomacy, maintaining peace with Islamic Egypt for over 600 years. When Arab armies tried to invade in the 7th century, Nubian archers repelled them so fiercely that a treaty was signed. one of the longest standing in history, a Christian kingdom in the heart of Africa, held its ground against the Islamic Caliphate. But history is relentless. By the 14th century, Islam spread gradually through trade, intermarriage, and migration. Sudan didn't fall to Islam, it absorbed it. Over centuries, Arabic language and Islamic faith became central to Sudanese identity, but not without internal transformations. Sufi brotherhoods gained influence, blending Islam with local customs. Sudan, by then, had become a unique cultural hybrid, African in soul, Islamic in faith, and Arabized in language. Then came the Ottomans, reaching from Turkey down through Egypt into northern Sudan in the 16th century. They established control over parts of the Nile Valley, mostly for trade and taxation, but deep control eluded them. The Sudanese interior remained fiercely autonomous, ruled by tribal chiefs, Islamic scholars, and warrior leaders. By the early 19th century, a new invader arrived, the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali, a man with Ottoman roots and imperial ambition. His troops moved south, establishing garrisons, taxing villages, and extracting slaves. This wasn't just about land, it was about human lives. Sudan became a vast reservoir for Egypt's slave trade, with devastating consequences for entire communities. Despite this brutal control, resistance simmered. Sudan wasn't conquered in silence. Every regime that set foot on its soil faced rebellion, desertion, and armed defiance. And soon, from the deserts of the West, a storm was brewing, one that would shake the foundations of empire itself. In the late 19th century, Sudan exploded into global headlines. It wasn't because of its gold, pyramids, or kingdoms, but because of a man who claimed he was the Mahdi, the guided one of Islam. His name was Muhammad Ahmad, and in 1881, he declared holy war against Egyptian and British rule. What followed was one of the most successful anti-colonial uprisings of the 19th century. Within just a few years, the Mahdist forces had captured Khartoum, killed British General Charles Gordon, a Victorian icon, and declared the establishment of the Mahdist state. For 13 years, Sudan was free from colonial control. It was chaotic, yes, brutal often, but it was self-ruled. The first independent Islamic state in Africa in modern times. The Mahdi died shortly after his victory, but his successor, Khalifa Abdullahi, ruled until the British returned with vengeance. In 1898, the British, allied with Egypt, launched a massive military campaign to reassert control. The Battle of Omdurman saw thousands of Mahdist soldiers killed by British Maxim guns, an early example of industrial warfare against poorly armed African forces. After this bloodbath, Sudan was placed under what they called a condominium, joint British and Egyptian rule. But make no mistake, Britain was in charge. From 1899 to 1956, Sudan was ruled as a colonial possession. The British divided the country deliberately. The North, Arabized and Islamic, received some development. The South, largely black and non-Muslim, was isolated, Christianized, and ignored. They banned Arabic in southern schools, discouraged Islam, and imposed separate laws. The seeds of division were sown, not by accident but by design. Under colonialism, Sudanese resources flowed out: cotton, gum, Arabic, livestock, enriching the empire while locals remained impoverished. Education was limited. Infrastructure was designed to extract, not connect. Resistance movements formed in secret. Intellectual circles debated nationalism, and Sudanese identity evolved in the shadows of occupation. Yet amid this control, a modern Sudanese consciousness began to rise. A new class of educated Sudanese elites emerged, questioning colonial authority, dreaming of independence. Nationalist movements grew louder, especially after World War II, and when Egypt's own revolution shook off the monarchy in 1952, the British position in Sudan became untenable in 1956. After decades of control, manipulation, and resistance, Sudan declared independence. But what should have been a triumph was already stained by a deep and deliberate divide between North and South, Arab and African, Muslim and Christian. Independence was won, but unity was not. The storm was just beginning. Sudan entered independence on January 1, 1956, waving its new flag with pride. Yet behind the celebrations was a ticking time bomb. The British had left a nation fractured, religiously, ethnically, and geographically. No clear plan existed for how to govern this vast and divided land. Within 2 years, the first military coup struck, setting a precedent that would define Sudan's politics for decades. From 1958 onward, Sudan fell into a pattern of military takeovers, failed civilian governments, and short-lived parliaments. By 1969, a young colonel named Darfur Meroë seized power, ushering in a socialist regime backed by the Soviet Union. His rule swung from radicalism to pragmatism, from leftist alliances to American partnerships. But behind the shifting ideologies lay the same persistent problem: civil war. The First Sudanese Civil War had already begun in 1955, even before independence, as the southern regions, feeling betrayed and excluded, rebelled against Khartoum. It lasted until 1972, when a peace deal briefly calmed the storm. But Meroë's decision in 1983 to impose Sharia law across the country, including the Christian and animist South, reignited tensions. The Second Sudanese Civil War broke out. This time it would last 22 brutal years. Meanwhile, Sudan became a Cold War chess piece. The U.S. and the USSR played influence games while Sudanese leaders exploited both sides. Arms flowed, allegiances shifted, and while elites struck deals, ordinary Sudanese citizens suffered under famine, displacement, and relentless conflict. The South bore the brunt. Entire villages burned, millions fled, and one of Africa's worst refugee crises unfolded. In 1985, Meroë was overthrown after mass protests. A brief democratic experiment followed, but by 1989, another coup, led by Omar al-Bashir, ended it. Backed by the Islamist ideologue Hassan al-Turabi, Sudan began a new chapter, one shaped by extremism, isolation, and internal purges. Sudan would soon become known worldwide not for its pyramids or revolutions, but for hosting Osama bin Laden and being labeled a state sponsor of terrorism. Hope flickered and died again and again. While the South bled in war, the capital shifted between repression and brief spells of civilian resistance. Through it all, the dream of a united, peaceful Sudan seemed to slip further out of reach. Yet beneath the surface, ordinary Sudanese people, students, farmers, activists, never stopped resisting. Another storm was coming, and this time it would shake the nation to its very core. By the early 2000s, Sudan was split in more ways than a map could show. After 2 decades of war and millions of lives lost, international pressure mounted to resolve the North-South conflict. In 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed. The deal granted the South autonomy for 6 years, with a referendum promised at the end. When that vote came in 2011, it wasn't even close. Over 98% voted for independence. On July 9, 2011, the world's newest nation was born, South Sudan. But Sudan didn't find peace. The secession left the north economically shattered. Over 75% of the country's oil fields were now inside South Sudan's borders. Sudan lost revenue overnight. Ethnic tensions that had been concentrated in the south now turned inward. One region, in particular, would become a global symbol of suffering. Darfur, a western region the size of France, had long been marginalized. In 2003, rebels from non-Arab ethnic groups rose against the government, demanding greater inclusion and development. The government responded with devastating force. It armed local Arab militias known as the Janjaweed. Unleashing a campaign of scorched earth violence, villages were burned, civilians slaughtered, and rape used as a weapon of war. Over 300,000 people were killed, and more than 2.5 million displaced. The world watched in horror. The United Nations called it the worst humanitarian crisis of the 21st century. In 2009, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Omar al-Bashir, charging him with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, the first sitting head of state to be indicted by the ICC. Yet al-Bashir remained in power. Despite sanctions, international outrage, and economic collapse, he continued to rule, propped up by patronage, security forces, and fractured opposition. Meanwhile, new conflicts simmered in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, where marginalized communities once again took up arms. Sudan had become a country at war with itself. While the international community debated resolutions and peacekeeping missions, it was the people on the ground who endured the real cost. Camps overflowed. Families were separated for generations, and yet, amid the rubble and despair, whispers of resistance began to build. Ordinary citizens, especially the youth, began organizing not for war, but for change. And in 2019, those whispers turned into a roar. For 30 years, Omar al-Bashir ruled Sudan with an iron grip, but no dictatorship lasts forever. By late 2018, the country was collapsing. Bread prices tripled, fuel lines stretched for miles. The currency spiraled into worthlessness. What began as small-scale protests over the cost of living quickly transformed into a nationwide revolt. The streets of Khartoum, Omdurman, and cities far beyond were filled with chants of freedom, peace, and justice. It wasn't just the scale of the protests. It was who led them: women, students, doctors, artists. The youth of Sudan, born during war and repression, took the reins. Social media became a battlefield of its own, amplifying the voices of those the regime tried to silence. The image of Allah Salah, a young woman standing atop a car in traditional dress leading chants, became the face of a revolution. Despite brutal crackdowns, killings, and mass arrests, the people didn't back down. In April 2019, after months of sustained pressure, the unthinkable happened. Omar al-Bashir was deposed by his own military, but the revolutionaries weren't fooled. They knew the generals wanted to keep power. So the protests continued, now demanding a civilian government. On June 3, 2019, the military responded with a massacre. Over 100 protesters were killed in Khartoum as security forces opened fire on a peaceful sit-in. The Nile ran red, and yet Sudan didn't break. Within weeks, international pressure and internal resistance forced a compromise. A transitional government was formed, composed of both military leaders and civilian technocrats. The world watched with cautious optimism. For the first time in decades, Sudan had a chance at real change. Bashir was imprisoned. Old repressive laws were repealed. The country began to re-engage with the world, removed from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terror, offered debt relief, and welcomed into diplomatic circles. One of the most significant moves came in 2020. Sudan officially ended Islam as the state religion, moving toward a secular state. For a country whose identity had been shaped for decades by imposed religious law, this was seismic. There was talk of women's rights, freedom of speech, and transitional justice. But revolutions are fragile things. The military, never comfortable with sharing power, waited for the moment to strike again. And in 2021, they did. A coup by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan dissolved the fragile alliance. The streets filled once more with protesters, this time not with hope, but with weary determination. The question loomed, could Sudan ever truly escape the cycle? By 2023, Sudan found itself spiraling into a nightmare of its own making. The dream of a post-Bashir democratic transition had evaporated. Tensions between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, once allies in coups and crackdowns, exploded into open war on April 15, 2023. The capital, Khartoum, became a battlefield. Airstrikes, tanks, and machine gun fire tore through neighborhoods. The very generals who promised to protect the nation were now tearing it apart. This wasn't a civil war sparked by ideology. It was a raw power struggle between two men, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, SAF, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hemedti, RSF. Both accused each other of plotting to seize full control. Neither would back down. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Schools turned into morgues, homes into trenches, hospitals into ruins. The humanitarian cost was catastrophic. Over 7 million people were displaced within months. Famine loomed as crops failed and aid routes were severed. The United Nations warned that Sudan was facing the world's worst displacement crisis. Entire cities were emptied. Families walked hundreds of kilometers to flee violence. Ethnic massacres flared up in Darfur once again, echoing the horrors of the early 2000s. International attention flickered, but never fully landed. Ukraine, Gaza, and global elections dominated headlines. Sudan became the world's forgotten war. Aid agencies were stretched thin, journalists were barred, and the fighting grew more brutal. Both sides targeted civilians. The RSF was accused of ethnically motivated killings. The SAF responded with indiscriminate bombings. No side showed mercy. Meanwhile, the country's infrastructure crumbled. Universities closed. Electricity vanished. The healthcare system collapsed. What had been a slow crawl toward recovery in 2019 was now a total free fall. And yet, people adapted. Underground schools were formed. Activists coordinated evacuations. Journalists risked their lives to report from hiding. Sudanese in the diaspora raised millions in aid. In the darkest of times, the light of resilience refused to die. But with no ceasefire in sight and both factions digging in, the question became urgent. How long can a nation survive when war is its only government? As the world moved on, Sudan bled, and still its people refused to bow. In the shadow of collapsed empires, forgotten revolutions, and untold suffering, Sudan endures. Not because it's been spared, but because its people are unbreakable. They have risen through pharaohs and colonizers, resisted dictators, weathered famine, and faced genocide, and still they march, chant, rebuild, and resist. This is not a story of pity, it's a story of power. Every chapter of Sudan's past points to one truth. This land refuses to bow, not to ancient Egypt, not to European colonialism, not to military generals, and certainly not to indifference. In a world quick to categorize nations as failed, poor, or irrelevant, Sudan screams otherwise. It is a place of kings and queens, scholars and revolutionaries, deserts and rivers, gold and grit, a place that gave the world the kingdom of Kush, the modest state, and now a revolution led by its youth. And yet, despite everything, Sudan stands at a crossroads. The war between SAF and RSF rages on. Millions remain displaced. Hunger stalks the land, but the future is not yet written. In Sudan's youth, in their creativity, their digital organizing, their unshakable belief in freedom, lies a force stronger than war. They don't want charity, they want change. Not handouts, but headlines, recognition, solidarity. So why should this matter to you? Because history doesn't just belong to the powerful, it belongs to those who fight to reclaim it. Sudan's story is a mirror, reflecting how the world treats injustice, how media attention is rationed, how geopolitics erases humanity. It challenges you to ask, what do we choose to care about? If you've watched this far, then you already know the answer. You care, and that matters because awareness is a seed. And with enough of them planted in enough minds, even the most silenced voices can grow into movements, into policy, into peace. Sudan is not broken, it is bruised, defiant, and unfinished. The land that refused to bow is still standing, still dreaming, still fighting. Subscribe for more stories that matter, like, share, and help others see what most will miss. Sudan's story isn't over, and neither is your role in it.